All right, guys. Well, you know, you all are standing in between a glass of wine and my flight back to Atlanta. Just want to let you know, okay? It's been a very long week. New Jersey, LA, San Diego. San Diego was fun. And now Sacramento. So I'm here. First of all, I want to say thank you all for coming into this session. And what I want to talk through is a unique role that we're seeing in state government, this role called the Chief Privacy Officer. I actually spent some time with a CPO. There are 3 CPOs now, well, actually 2. One is Ohio, a person by the name of Daring, and then there's a Chief Privacy Officer in West Virginia and South Carolina. They're coming out with their CPO. So a great role, but what I want to spend time in talking through, one is their program methodology they took in building out their privacy program, from creating policy to the user awareness portion of it, as well as being able to connect with the business. That's the first thing. The second is to talk about some of the tools and technologies and strategies that they're looking at leveraging. In particular, a governance, risk, and compliance framework to gather and drive more oversight for Darryl in this role. So those are the top 2 bullets. And then what I thought I would do is walk you through a recommended program to build a security and privacy program. Because if you think about privacy and security really go hand in hand, right? Privacy is all about the what, right? What information, how long should I store this information and retain it, right? And security is all about how. Right? So they really go hand in hand. So that's the agenda, and I will warn you, this is the first time I've presented on this, so I'm test driving this material, so it works great since I have my glass of wine later while I'm looking at the reviews from you all, the favorable reviews, I should say. And so what I want to do is I want to walk you through just a fundamental shift in the threat landscape, and then we'll get into the presentation itself. So when you think about the threat landscape, and I can remember this over a decade ago, it was all about hacking, the hacker making a name for himself. I own you, I have access to your system, and now I can scan that system for personal identifiable information. And so I have 2 pens here, and Robert, you can't answer this question here because I think you've heard me ask it before. So the first person that can tell me what's in common between Miss Teen USA and a businessman, I'll give you this pen. Okay? Well, what's that?
Their social media accounts?
Close, but that's not it. And when I presented this in Harvard, someone said they both don't have a clue. So can't use that one either. So what's in common is they both were victims of targeted attacks. Okay? So Miss Teen USA, a person by the name of Carrie Wolf, if you want to go out and do a Google search on her, she was anointed this title. And so a person by the name of Jared Abrams decided that he wanted more personal pictures, if you will, of Miss Carrie. So what he did is he hacked her laptop, and he was able to infiltrate her webcam and capture personal revealing pictures of her. And not only that, but he messaged everyone on Facebook, her on Facebook rather, and said that your dreams of becoming a model will be ruined if you don't give me more provocative pictures and photos. So true story, and he used a commonly available toolkit. So it's all about hacking, but what we're saying is that the attacks are more targeted attacks, not only for financial gain, but for personal gain. Cybercrime. Great one here. A few years back, I talked about a report that we released from Symantec. It's called our Internet Security Threat Report, and how much your information was going for. So credit cards are going for 0 or 30 cents to $1. But now what the bad guys are after is your date of birth, your first and last name, and your address, because what they're doing is they're creating identity fraud with that information. And not only that, but if they have your health information, guess what? They're applying for benefits on your behalf. So that's scary right there. to go in and be misdiagnosed because of someone stealing your information itself. Cyber espionage. So if you're familiar with the Mandiant report, a great report to read up on, it talks about a state-sponsored group in China that basically was able to infiltrate tons of information from the U.S. So from the K-12s and higher ed community itself. So we're seeing these attacks move from hacking to cyber espionage, and then the last is cyber warfare. Okay. A few years back, if you're familiar with Stuxnet is a piece of malcode that stole 2 Windows certificates and was able to find itself on the Windows desktop, and then from there it was copied to a USB, and someone actually took it into an air-gapped community. So air-gapped meaning that it doesn't have access to the internet, and with the intent to do harm. So this was an Iranian SCADA system. So again, I thought it was important working for Symantec that I would at least give you some backdrop in terms of what we're seeing from the threat landscape itself. So now, to talk about this role, this Chief Privacy Officer. So Daryl is the CPO, and in interviewing him, I found that he has a background, a legal background. So I met some of you all in the room, and I believe there are some folks that have similar backgrounds as well. But he was able to leverage that information as an IT policy analyst to a senior analyst to eventually become the state's first Chief Privacy Officer. And so, and speaking to him around a privacy program, he said, Renault, privacy is all about ensuring that I have oversight, right? So the example, if there's a third-party vendor and I'm looking to leverage some type of cloud management service and capability, that's really a conversation between IT and legal, and making sure that the right contractual verbiage is in the contract, so that the third party will release the results of their SAS 70 Type 2 audits, that the controls that they have in place within the organization, that the third party will ensure that they're realizing those controls as well. So again, I talked about privacy oversight, and then the other area, and I like to say that, vulnerabilities exist within the network, the operating system, as well as applications. But if you think about it, the vulnerability is really between the chair and the keyboard in many cases, right? It's the person. So no matter how many technologies and controls you have in place, if you don't have a user awareness campaign and ensure that the folks are doing the right stuff with the right information, it's like not having any technology at all, right? Example, if someone wants to infiltrate the Symantec network, all they have to do is send an email, hey Renault, great presentation, I hope you enjoy your glass of wine and your flight home. Here's a picture of you, double click this link. Guess what? I double click the link, I'm redirected over to the bad guy's site, and he's taking advantage of a vulnerability, not in the operating system, but maybe the browser, the third-party plug-in itself. So again, when you look at the privacy program, it's all about privacy oversight, this thing called awareness itself, all right? And so, in speaking to Daryl, Daryl, who are your stakeholders, right? And it's the Inspector General, it's IT, it's legal, all of these folks have to be on the same page, right? And if you think about it from a policy standpoint, when you're creating policy, but the business unit is signing off on it, right? Because they have to set any exceptions within the policy itself. And not only that, that policy has to be updated. There's a traceability component that's tied to it. So those are his stakeholders. And his role is to understand what's important to the state. So example, there's a Joe the Plumber law out. So you guys remember Joe the Plumber, obviously, right? But after he made his comments, rather, someone from a political side, I'm not going to say, they decided to run a background check on Joe to see if he had some overdue child support payments. so anyway, so that's state law, right? But there's external laws in terms of HIPAA, if you're familiar with that. That's, I will protect your electronic personal health information itself. And there are other mandates. Someone earlier was speaking about tax. So if you're familiar with 1075 IRS, that you will have the appropriate safeguards in place. So again, his job is to understand, what are those particular roles, the mandates rather. And then, not only that, how can I ensure that the agencies are protecting that information, but most importantly, this thing called assessment. So what they're doing is, and we'll just take HIPAA for example, the agencies, the covered entities with the electronic personal health information, they're actually doing an impact assessment. So if you all are familiar with that. So they're doing a self-assessment, and then the Inspector General, the auditors, are coming back and they're looking at the results of that impact assessment to ensure that they're doing what's right as indicated by HIPAA, which talks about having the 18 safeguards in place: administrative, physical, technical. And then the other part is that drives the evidence, but not only that, but being able to report on compliancy. And then the last piece is remediation, right? Closing the gap itself. So again, in talking through his roles and responsibilities, is to understand what's important to the state as it pertains to policy. Not only that, but to educate the agencies and ensure that they have some type of assessment, self-assessment capability in place, and then obviously to report on the any gaps within the agencies itself. So the methodology in talking to Darryl is the first thing that he did is he created policy, right? I mean, that's 101. I mean, you got to have policy drives technology, right? I find some folks, some organizations are very tactical. They're just throwing technology at a business problem. So the types of policies that he created were both user-specific and issue-specific policies. So a system-specific policy could be related to a HIPAA system and ensuring that Joe, that's part of the secret super users group, doesn't have access to all the records within HIPAA. Or information that's coming into the environment, is it HIPAA related? Does it actually have 1075 information included in it? And why? Why is that? The second policy is this thing called data classification. And I'm going to spend a little time and talk through not only the policy piece of it, but what he's looking at in terms of the tools, the strategies to classify data. And data classification is who owns the information, right? Because let's face it, in technology, we're pretty much data custodians, right? We don't know who, the owner can set the appropriate safeguards if that's low, medium, high, if you're looking at some type of NIST best practice, particularly NIST FIPS 199, which talks about how to place the user value. Other policies, social media, right? If I'm sending content outside of the infrastructure, again, to any social media sites. So those are just some examples of the policies that were created. User awareness, I talked about that earlier, and so basically he's working with a champion within the various agencies, and so he's in charge of creating what that program should be, and not only that, but working with the liaison that he has within the organization to ensure that the user awareness program is carried out. I spent a little time talking about data classification, and I want to spend time talking about the tooling, but he's looking at a way of how can he automate some of the manual processes to classify data. Because if you think about it, how can you do, if you're familiar with data loss prevention, and what that is it prevents sensitive data from leaving the organization. So it serves as a watchguard, if you will, a watchdog, in terms of is it at the network or the endpoint, and it prevents it from leaving. But you have to have a way to classify that information first to set the appropriate controls. And then the last area is, we'll jump to the last area, is how can he make his program more efficient, essentially. And so the program efficiencies, this is a perfect segue in terms of the technologies and capabilities that we're talking to him about. So the conversation we're having is, okay, right now everything is pretty much manual at this point. So capabilities where you can have data collectors, the state can have these data collectors essentially, and it will consume data from various systems. So let's just say you have Windows systems and Unix and Oracle systems and mainframes. And so the value here for Darryl and the state is that HIPAA states that thou shalt send tapes off every 6 days. That's a manual control, right? How do you attest that's happening? Well, maybe there's a questionnaire, right? That, hey, have you sent the tapes off site? And all that information is pulled up into some report. That's one example, right? I talked about the third-party vendor management. Are you doing ABC in terms of your security hygiene, right? They have to fill out that questionnaire. Now, I can at least say with some certainty there's a risk metric, a score associated, with that particular vendor. So that's just one example. So going back to the data that's collected in this area, HIPAA states that HIPAA states that before logging on the system, it should be a complex password. But now what I can do is I can take a standard HIPAA and I can basically look within that repository to see if there's compliance in place. And the last example I give you, the RS 1075 is basically using NIST underneath the hood. So if they have to attest or align with 1075, that's a policy, well, there's a NIST standard, essentially, and all I'm doing is I'm scanning that repository to ensure that there's some type of compliance in place. And so what that's doing is it's ultimately allowing him to understand where he is in terms of his risk and adhering to the various policies that are in place. So I talked a little bit about this, the development and managing policies. And if you think about it, it's really a relationship not only between IT but business, rather to define them and to ensure that the right folks have some type of oversight and they can sign off and or set exceptions when it comes to policy. And so the type of technology I talked about earlier, that governance, risk, and compliance, drives that first phase, which is the policy life cycle. It's really creating it. It's making sure that the stakeholders are all on the same page and being able to review that. The other piece is just the manual effort alone, right? But being able to reduce risk, drive up efficiencies, if I can now start to automate certain things, if it's a survey, right? You talk about user awareness, right? So a lot of organizations are looking at how they can create some type of phishing awareness campaign, right? And then being able to measure those types of controls. So that would be one example. And then if you look at being able to tie back to the various standards. So if you're familiar with the CSF, which is the Cyber Security Framework, which was signed in to law not too long ago, I think 136. But he's looking to align with that. And that type of tooling will look in that repository to see if there's some type of alignment to some of the industry best practices that are already out there. SANS Top 20 is another best practice. I talked about the NIST framework, if you're familiar with that. That's the NIST 853, which is pretty common, right? And then risk from third parties. So again, this could be internal, it could be external, but I need to know the temperature of the risk before doing business with you, right? Before, that's all about ensuring that it's legal, it's IT, the right languages in the contract, but even during, right, when you're housing the information, are you still ensuring that those controls are in place? Let me see a copy of your SAS 70 Type 2 audit to ensure that you're compliant. And not only that, but based off of the requirement, we're going to perform our vulnerability assessments on the third parties. But again, we're able to keep all this information into a repository and measure what that looks like. The last area, and so this bleeds over into the IT side. As I mentioned earlier, privacy and IT are the same, essentially. Do you have a question?
Oh, no, we wanted a picture of the last slide.
Oh, you want a picture of the last slide? That's going to cost you a pen. Okay. And so I'll make the presentation available. Okay. And so when you think about vulnerability assessment, so the security arm is looking at the vulnerabilities within the environment. If it's the ports, the services, the applications, but being able to take all of that information and ingest that into that policy framework, that dashboard that I mentioned earlier. And then overall compliance. So, recap. His job is really to ensure that the external policies are being met, and then to assess the agencies to ensure that the agencies have the proper controls in place along with the user awareness capabilities. This is the tooling, if you will, to help drive up some of the efficiencies and automate what he's doing on the back end. So the end goal is, it's really three different areas, right? One is going to be all about how do I ensure that my privacy and security program is in place from the physical to the cloud, right? I gave you a lot of examples on the third-party cloud management and those capabilities, but systems are moving into a virtual world now, right? But it's the information. If I lose my cell phone, you know, it's not the phone, it's the pictures of my little dog Fluff Fluff I'm concerned about. Just joking, I don't have a little dog Fluff Fluff. Yeah. All right, don't tell anyone. All right. But the other thing is, it's all about this thing called, you know, the data classification, being able to classify that information and then to discover, right? If I find it, why can't I use a data loss prevention to fix it or prevent it? And then not only that, but if you think about the life cycle of information, I need to archive that information either to the premise and or cloud. So that information intelligence, and then ultimately that information governance is the framework that starts, you know, those types of controls in place. So it's a lot of information. So what I want to do now is I want to step back and I want to walk you all through building a information and privacy, security and privacy program. And so this may serve as a gap analysis to some of the stuff that you're already doing. And if not, it should serve as awareness. And if you think about it, I spent 20 minutes going through the whole developing policies. It makes sense to do that, right? These are some tools and capabilities, so if I make this slide available, you can have this later. That's one phase of it. The second is you got to make it hard for the wrong person to get into the system, right? So you've heard of the two-factor authentication. That's something you have and something you know, right? It could be your phone, which is something you have, and there's a token that changes every 30 seconds, right? Along with your Active Directory credentials. It makes it hard for the person to get in. The next is, let's assume the person has access to the system. It's all about now, I talked about the watchdog, right? Preventing the exfiltration of data, right? So data loss prevention type of stuff. But there may be information that may not leave the infrastructure, and that's an encryption, to encrypt that information itself. And then the last, I gave you the example of Miss Teen USA and a businessman, but being able to patch not only the system itself, but actually the browser and the plugins itself. So 70% of legitimate websites have malware on them, right? Because what the bad guys are doing is they're actually renting ad space. So I'm going to give you a new tech term. It's called malvertising, if you see that, right? So you can go to a legitimate website, bankofamerica.com, and guess what? If you want to refinance your house, you double-click the link. It's not associated with bankofamerica.com itself. So again, organizations have to look at how do they patch the browser as well as the third-party plugins. And then the last area is really protecting the infrastructure, defense in depth, right? Making it hard for the bad guys to get to the crown jewels. And I was in Philadelphia when I was talking through protecting the infrastructure, and I was trying to make it simple. And I said, it's like a bad guy going into a neighborhood. You have two homes, and you have this homeowners covenant, right? That's a policy. And bad guy jumps the fence, and I had already gone through all the technical stuff. That's that thing that's called a firewall. He jumps the fence and he kills the pit bull, and I don't know why I said that. Yeah, I said, well, Michael Vick is having a great year. Sorry about that. But that's for the email protection, right? That's for the well protection. And then he gets into the house, right? So the burglar alarm needs to go off. So that thing that's called a security information event manager. And then if he gets past that, you have, you know, my Nina, my handgun, my IPS, right? And someone earlier told me, they said, well, Renault, if they get past that, then you have insurance. That's true, right? You know, you look at cyber insurance. So hopefully you get my point as it relates to this. So developing policy, I won't spend a lot of time here. We talked about that, right? It's having some type of repository to pull information in, having a tool to capture all the various policies. If it's 1075, if it's HIPAA, or if it's GOBA, all of that stuff to ensure that I'm compliant with it in building the program. And then the access control. This is great right here, because if you look at two-factor authentication, it's not only the state citizen connecting to a government system, but it's the government system authenticating back to the citizen. Let me give you an example. So I want to log into an environment, right? I have my phone, there's a pin that changes every 30 seconds, as you can see, right? It makes it hard to get in. But how do I know that's a legitimate system that I'm connecting to, right? Because the bad guys can throw up a phony, fake website. And so this is this whole thing called certificates. So if you've ever gone out to the internet, and well, I don't think we all have, and the only time I go outside is when the internet is down. But you've seen that, you know, this may be a mismatch certificate. I know we've all seen that warning itself. So that's two-factor authentication. And then you have other ways in terms of the one-time token. That's one example. But maybe there's an SMS message, or maybe there's a voice call associated with it again. So policy then drives access control. And then the other piece, when you think about access control, I'm really excited about this, is that access control is, what we're saying is that now we're able to look at the attributes, the behavior, and the context, and tie that into a risk score to allow someone to log into an environment or prevent them from logging in. Let me give you an example. Take my smart device out. Well, I don't have it here. But if I don't use my PIN and I am trying to connect to the environment from a unsecure, untrusted environment, and the time of day, now I can prevent someone from logging into the environment, because what it's doing is it's not looking at the user itself, it's looking at the attributes of the session. So you're going to hear a lot about, it's called contextual-based authentication, right? So it's the bigger brother to two-factor authentication. So again, that will be access control itself. And then protecting the information. So recap, the policy, you made it hard to get in, now protecting the information. And this is what is referred to as data loss prevention. So DLP, or data leakage prevention, depending on the vendor you talk to. But it's three things. Where's my information at to start with, right? So being able to scan if it's a Windows system or a network. Not only that, but let me make sure that Sue is not sending credit card numbers to a personal Gmail account because she wants to get work done over the weekend. And we find that so often that people just don't know. They don't realize sending an email is like sending a postcard. Everyone can read it, right? But this is a broken process. And maybe being able to block that from occurring and tying it back to that whole governance, risk, and compliance framework policy. Hey, Sue, do you realize you're violating policy, sending this information, blah, 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 okay? So that would be data loss prevention itself, protecting the information. And a portion of that, and I told you I was going to spend a little time on this right here, is this whole thing of data classification. So being able to identify the data itself. And so with that, if I can just scan a repository of just information, and I can say, Renault, access this file 70% of the time, Renault, are you the data owner? That's huge, because what I'm doing is I'm looking at the inferred owner of that information. I used to be an engineer, and back in the day, it was all about being able to go in and disable some of those functionalities. When you created a file, you said administrator. All right, and then from there, I can do some cool stuff. I can start to tie it back to the data owner and identify the usage pattern. So if you're from the HR department, why are you accessing information in a HIPAA environment itself, right? Because now I can tie that back to who accessed the file itself. A lot of great stuff that you can do outside of data ownership. Another cool thing, this is more on the storage side. If I haven't accessed this file in 8 days, move it from my more expensive storage, which is called Tier 1 storage, to Tier 2 storage, and then maybe from Tier 2 to Tier 3, and then to archive and backup. So again, a lot of great challenges it solves. The second is encryption. And I talked a little bit about encryption, but if anyone is responsible for EPHI, know that high tech, which adds more teeth to HIPAA, states that if you're not doing good key management, it's like not doing encryption at all. It's like me locking my front door, going out to the park and coming back, finding that the key is missing, essentially. So again, that key management is important. But using that data loss prevention technology to say, well, this is sensitive information, but I'm going to move this information into a certain area of the environment and be able to encrypt it. So that's an integration between DLP and encryption itself. So got a little animation going there. And then the fourth area is being able to manage the infrastructure. So gave you the example of the browser vulnerabilities, but it's really a lot of stuff. It's really about the mobile, and someone told me this a while back. I said, you know what BYOD means? And this person is in the room. He said, yeah. Bring your own disaster. Mr. Robert. So I'm reusing that here. So I give you credit the first time, the second time I own it. All right. Okay. And so this is the whole system management infrastructure, being able to patch software delivery, because what that does is closing the vulnerabilities in the background itself. All right. And then the last area, so I talked about the fence, the pit bull, burglar alarm, all that good stuff. This is making it hard for the bad guys to even get to the crown jewels, right? So this is your endpoint technologies, so it's some type of malware capability, behavior-based detection. But the pit bull, the messaging, email, as well as web, because what that does is it makes it very expensive for the bad guy to try to get in. So they're looking to move elsewhere, all right? So a lot of content, a lot of information, and I just put this together the other day. This slide is a really cool slide, so I'm excited to talk about it. So, so if you think about it, we're in the asymmetric fight between the good guys and bad guys. The reason why is Symantec, we produce technologies that you go to Best Buy and buy, but the problem is that the bad guys, they can go and buy the same technology and reverse engineer those technologies. So I'm going to take you through a series of what ifs, okay? So first of all, if you look at the endpoint technologies, they block malware. That's great. You look at the firewall, it's looking at traffic coming in, it's making a decision to allow, block, and log, right? You're looking at email security, it's looking at email attachments and detecting those. And then you got your server security logs. That's that thing they call a security information event manager. It takes logs from different systems and it correlates it to look for abnormal behavior. And then you have an administrator that controls all of those different areas, so different administrators. Now, I'm going to take you on a series of what if. What if, and hopefully you don't get dizzy, because I was putting this together, I was like, man, this is something else here. What if you could take your security log information, right, on the endpoint, and then marry what's happening at the gateway, right, the firewall. This is great stuff, and I got a slide that's going to walk through it. So everything that's coming into the network, the firewall is looking at. But if I can just say, well, you know what, my endpoint technology already detected that, and do some type of correlation. And what if I can take that information and get more intelligence with an attachment, that attachment was released into the environment, but now someone is targeting that attachment for some type of what they call an advanced persistent threat, which is a highly sophisticated attack. And then what if I can tie that into Renault just logged into the system 5 minutes ago, and all of this stuff, right? So a series of what ifs, all right? And not only that, but what if I can just take all the logon history of every time that a machine logged in or tried to log onto another machine, as well as the email history itself. That's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of attributes, right? So the good thing is, and I'll take it to the slide, is that today is very manual. So this extends the protecting the infrastructure. And what you're going to hear is that vendors are coming out with technologies for advanced threats. And so what they're doing now is, say something comes in through the environment, and that's the firewall. They have to actually tell somebody that, hey, this may be bad traffic, essentially. And then not only that, but now they have to tell someone that's in charge of all the endpoint technologies to go and do something itself, right? So AV, endpoint protection itself. But if you look at tomorrow, what organizations are looking at doing is being able to tie the intelligence of all of the different systems together to do something that's called predictive analytics. This is really cool stuff, right? So basically, something comes in the environment. I'll give you the example. And say there's a next generation firewall. It sees a file, because a firewall, in some cases, will not block that file because it'll slow the network down. So it will take a copy of that file itself, and then we're able to point that to some type of cloud, if you will, threat management cloud. And basically what we're doing is we're looking at that file and we're comparing that against 2.4 billion files that are out there across 40,000 vulnerabilities that we know about across 15,000 vendors and their products and our services, right? That's the threat cloud. We can do some cool stuff at that point. One is we can make the firewalls a lot smarter. The second thing is we can say, well, you don't really need to respond to that, because you know what? Based off of our cloud, you've already detected that within your environment itself, and this was the root cause of it. So a lot of stuff, and that's referred to as advanced threat technology, but you're going to see that coming out from a lot of vendors itself. So I know there was a lot of information I presented, and you have any questions, I'll be here for the next 20 minutes before heading out to Atlanta to have my glass of wine and see if my son cleaned his room. And I want to say thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it, and I'll be here for questions.